uh, to to join this meeting. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I'm excited just to share with you a few points and maybe, some provocations on sort of this topic of ethics and AI and how this, how it's working and, its limitations, its potential, and hopefully have a really good discussion with you all. I would like to sort of start with this, sort of like with this central problem that I've noticed within ethical AI or ethics in AI, as well as in artificial intelligence systems. It seems that the same problems, the same set of problems that we think of when we're critiquing, the biases in AI, the harms it could make on societies, especially those who have been marginalized, are actually also the same set of problems that we can say about ethics and AI. One major foundational problem is that when we talk about some of these harms of AI, we often say, well, there isn't enough diversity. Let's have people from oppressed groups. Let's have, minorities, and, the list goes on and on and on. However, when we look at the question of ethics and AI, we find that the same issue is still there. Normally, when you go to an ethics and AI discussion, right, and people proposing different solutions, utilitarianism, or we could use some of Kant's theories, or whatever the case is, it always ends up being that we're clinging to mostly Western frameworks, right? So it's almost saying that these Western philosophers, these great minds from Euro-American world, their views on ethics, their views on how the world should be, their views on how people should live, are going to sort of help us, fix the problems that we have within AI. But we're reproducing that same core issue, which is the lack of diversity in the first place. And so how do we even get to such a place? It almost seems quite obvious. If you're saying there's diversity issues in AI, we should be the ones who are most trained to also say, wait, do we also have diversity issues within ethics and AI? But diversity isn't just I don't want to dwell on this idea that, oh, let's just have different people just for the sake of, have a nice ratio of people from different groups. But the key concern with having this diversity issue is that we're almost saying that prominent Euro-American values should be used as sort of like these essential values to be universalized, right? In other words, as long as our thinkers in this part of the world have thought about it, it's enough, right? It should cover all of the host of problems. We have the solutions within our own thinkers, within our own canons, but we never go and say, well, I wonder what do Africans have to say about the issues that come up with artificial intelligence? How about the Asian continent? How about indigenous people, people in South America, right? What do their knowledge systems have to say? Why do we sort of, in general, assume that we have, in the Western world, right? We have sort of like this universal way of viewing the world. If we think about it here within our circles, it'll be enough, right? It's going to sort of address the core issues that we find when we're deploying artificial intelligence systems, or even thinking about the ethical issues that come with that. And that paternalism, I think that's sort of the key problem, which we find within when we're thinking about ethics in AI, and also even in creating artificial intelligence systems. If we look at sort of AI in a very general, wide-ranging way, it almost tries to make universal assumptions, right? You take some data sets and you train on them and you apply them widely and broadly. And we've seen the harms of that when we take these ideas that really are sort of localized, right? Built in an isolation by a homogeneous group that may not have, a broad understanding of other communities or other parts of the world, and then deploying systems built like that. So if we're critiquing that process in the development of artificial intelligence, why not also critique that same process when we think about these ethical issues and ethical solutions to sort of the biases that we're thinking about when it comes to AI. But I'd like to even go a little bit further and say, well, was ethics missing anyways? You know, is it really absent? Or like what, or are the harms that we're viewing and sort of like this universalist view of the world, or, you know, could that be sort of a reflection of how we truly see the world? You know, one way to think about it is to say, you know, are humans moral agents with the capacity to make moral choices? And if that's the case, then when we're choosing the features to build, when we're choosing who gets funding, especially with the disparities in who gets funding, we're sort of choosing the problems to get solved. And in some ways, we're determining how the world ought to be, how the world should be, which problems matter, which problems deserve to get solved, which communities deserve to have solutions built for them. In some ways, these are sort of moral choices. These are sort of ethical choices. These are our values. We're sort of indicating our values. We're indicating how we view the world. We're indicating what we want the world to be like through a creation of these systems. So in some ways, it's not so much quite missing. It's sort of indicative of how we perceive AI, how we perceive our role as a society in response to AI, how we perceive the systems that actually sustain this industry, not just looking at AI as sort of this isolated industry, but sort of seeing everything else, the societal factors, the economic factors, the political factors, everything that actually shapes AI, right? That might actually be representative of a particular way of viewing the world. And so this is what I'd like to sort of, you know, dwell on today and try to critique a little bit and to suggest that, you know, why we're sort of experiencing some of these issues, it goes back to an underlying philosophical problem, really. It goes back to just how we view the world, and sort of this idea of objective rationality as sort of like this universal virtue, this universal value system that will allow us to sort of be able to make sense of the world and be able to, you know, improve human lives, which is also quite flawed to begin with. If we go back to sort of the origins of AI, before any code, before the first computer scientists, before, you know, any algorithms, we can sort of go back even as far as, say, to the early Greeks. Aristotle is known to have given a quote saying that man is a rational animal, right? Rational. So meaning that using our minds, we have sort of this rationality that's far greater than other animals. And so we're able to objectively look at the world, and we can objectively come to conclusions that are truthful. We can objectively reach sort of true conclusions. And we see sort of the same pattern of thinking also being reproduced by many mathematicians and logicians such as Leibniz, who was saying, you know, who spent a lot of his life trying to create this mathematical language that would be able to capture this rationality. In other words, Leibniz thought that, you know, you could have like sort of this algebra where you can represent every single sort of concept that humans can think of in a mathematical way, and then have a machine where you can then plug in this mathematics, and then you can compute and you could reach logical conclusions. So maybe let's say, you know, we're trying to choose or elect a president, right? We would take the mathematical variable for this candidate and for that candidate and for that candidate, put that into a machine, and then it would sort of give us some type of objective truth. And doing this, and he was also inspired by another mathematician, Ramon Lal, who taking this idea of like rationality as this core human essence, as his core value. He sort of made this thing called the logic circle, and he wanted to convert Muslims, or what he called infidels, to become Christian. And his idea was that if you have this rational circle, this machine that he created, and if humans are rational, then any Muslim would logically see the truth and become a Christian because of this rational circle, right? Sort of like emphasizing this idea of rationality. And Francis Bacon, sort of the Englishman, the so-called father of the scientific method, he's known for saying that there's nothing that separates a king from a peasant. If you have, it's all about the power of the mind. You can have mastery over nature. So as long as use your rational mind, you can overcome anything, right? It's like, you can sort of free yourself, and you can have more certainty. You can better, optimize your own life. You can optimize the markets. You can optimize the economy. It's all about, sort of like this essence of, rationality. However, something that was never quite fully disclosed, which we see as well from the historical record, was that, well, rational to who, right? And we find that often that this was just sort of like this cover, right, to try to support or push Euro-American conquest, right, to sort of validate that, this is the default human, this is the default person, and this is the way to sort of think about, how the world in life should be. And these are the same ideologies that would later on justify slavery of Africans, would later justify colonization, because we have to go and rationalize people and bring them to a higher level of being a person. So why am I sort of going back there? Well, to this sort of central idea of being a person. Well, if we're thinking about computing, for example, thinking about the Turing test, right? It's almost like artificial intelligence is a way to try to replicate or imitate human abilities and human thoughts. Not in the same exact way as how the brain actually works, but the outcome should look like as if a human was doing that. So with the Turing test, right, you're speaking to a computer on the other side of a screen, right? And then you should be able to be fooled such that you cannot tell, wait, is this a human or is this a machine, right? So it's supposed to like develop this ability, right, where it can, even converse with you as if it's a human being. Well, if you're building systems that are designed to be human-like, you need to first define what does it mean to be a human in the first place, right? What are the things that matters to being a person? How do you protect people? What are the rights that humans need in order to feel human, in order to feel dignified? And it's quite interesting. So I think there was this UN general session that's been happening, actually. I think it's over by now. And the president of Ghana made some quite remarkable statements. And he suggested that had the human rights documents, the first ones in the 1940s, if they had been written today in 2021, when much of the African continent was free, we would have a radically different set of human rights, right? But we were not involved in that process to decide, well, what do we need as African people to feel dignified, right? What matters to us, right? Is it just this way of viewing the world, or, like being an individual? Because, if you're rational, then you need the freedom to be an individual, to use your rational mind, right? And so that we then support this sort of emphasis on individualism. But then in other societies, we can, yes, Ramon Lal, the colored line philosopher, I'm looking at the comments. Yeah, I lost my train of thought there. But yes, so when we have like this sort of emphasis on rationality and on individual, ability, we sort of will lose aspect of sort of like this other idea of how we actually work together as a community in society. And so the main point there that I want to now sort of then emphasize is that, it's not enough to just say, well, humans are rational, we have logical minds, we can compute and so forth. That's not necessarily what makes us humans. And that's not necessarily what makes AI powerful, right? We've learned to give so much power and so much prestige to artificial intelligence simply because we say, well, it's doing the rational objective thing, right? This emphasis, and it's the same sort of, again, the same sort of underlying assumption about AI ethics. Well, we just find great philosophers, and then, from our Western canon, and, their views should be applied globally because these were the greats, they've looked at these issues with, sort of, from their own perspectives. But again, that's not the case, because even how we view justice, it differs, right? How we view even what being a human means. If we look at, for example, the Ubuntu philosophy from the African continent, it's usually popularized by, the Nobel Peace Prize winners, Desmond Tutu, and Nelson Mandela, and so forth. But even how personhood is framed in Ubuntu is radically different. It's quite different than how these Western greats would have framed it. Being a person is not just being rational, right? Having an objective mind, being able to view the world, whatever rationality means. I don't even know if you can actually even measure that, right? But whatever, it's more than that. It's sort of like related to how you relate to other people. In fact, one of the most popular or foundational sayings about Ubuntu is that a person is a person through other persons, right? So there's this relationality, and this relationality is what makes us really who we are, how we relate to each other, how we interact with each other. It sort of ties our humanity with each other, with the environment. And so me being a person is not enough to me to be a person as an individual. My personhood then relates to your personhood, and how I enrich your humanity, or how I harm your humanity also either enriches my own humanity, or it actually worsens it. So we find even just down the other side of the world, right, or up the other side of the world, we find even just a radical view of personhood. And the question then becomes, well, what if we would change? What if we would change, and what if we change and accept a different type of personhood, right? Or how would AI be if the underlying value of who a person is might even be different? If we switched from not just being rational, but also thinking about relationality, with the sort of Ubuntu view as well, the concept of justice sort of changes a bit as well. And I'd like to dwell on this just to sort of, really make the point really clear that, even something that we think is sort of like natural, like our view of justice, can also be totally different. I think a lot about, some of you may know about the Truth and National Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa and has happened in other parts of the African continent, to be frank, at the end of apartheid. So we find that, for example, let's say after World War I, World War II, we find that, after the war ended, there were sort of like these Nuremberg trials, or these courts to try to, punish the criminals who committed some of the worst crimes during the war, right? And the idea there sort of borrows from like this Kantian notion of, an eye for an eye, right? So justice is that if you do something wrong, you must pay you must pay your dues. You commit the crime, you must commit the time. And that seems just, right, towards many people, right? Okay, so now fast forward to South Africa, a population that has been colonized for hundreds of years. They're now finally free, right? In 1994, in our lifetime, many of us, and now they have control to the army, they have access to the police, they control the government, they have everything. And essentially they can also say, well, an eye for an eye, right? You guys did us wrong, you oppressed us, you stole from us, so we're going to punish you accordingly, and and take back everything. However, in their concept of justice, they felt that it was sort of wrong to to sort of operate that way, because by harming others, intentionally inflicting that harm, they would also be harming their own humanity, their own personhood. And so their logical conclusion was that, well, if we want to have a harmonious society, right? If we want to save our society from collapsing and failing and becoming, this destructive place to be in, we need to offer that, we need to offer a different version of justice, right? We need to restore those who were dehumanized, not just the Black people who were dehumanized, but also also some of the white people who also partook in oppressing others. Because in their view, in order to oppress someone else, you have to throw away your own humanity. And so now you have two groups that need to be restored to being persons again, and they all deserve a chance. So in this just example, right, we can see contrasting different views, right, of what justice could be, of what a person is. And the underlying problem with sort of this ethics and AI itself can sort of trace down to these foundational ideas. Who are we as people? Who is the default person? Whom does AI work for? Who is protected by AI? Who bears most of the harms that can happen when AI goes wrong, right? If we had a different conception maybe of what being a person is, if we had a different conception of that, we should be more humble, and instead find, ways to strengthen our relationality, how we relate to each other, how we include others into the process of building AI, into the process of distributing AI, into the process of using AI. We might have different effects, not just in creating AI, but even in how we think about the ethical issues or the ethical harms of AI. So yes, ethical AI, it can help, but so far, it's been quite a challenge, right? There's been just this past year alone, there was a prominent case of top Google ethical AI researchers who were let go for allegedly doing their job, right? For, doing the right thing, for pointing out harm. So even in just that one incident, it can cause us to sort of doubt and say, well, okay, so I guess that doesn't work. Well, yeah, I mean, I think what that example shows is that just having people who are diverse in the organization or in the system is not necessarily the true form of change that can actually bring the sort of needed results that we need, right? It's almost like we need to sort of think about sort of this new conception of how should we relate to each other? How should AI relate to humans? How should we relate to AI? How should we include people in their process? What should we be solving for, right? What should we be optimizing for, right? It's sort of more than just placing people there for diversity, but sort of even changing the guiding assumptions, right? Being more humble, about, sort of this objectivity, and bringing others into the fold. I think that is sort of one way that we can actually advance how we think about ethics and AI. In the US, the past 2 days, there's been this hearing where they've been discussing Facebook and discussing, some of the harms that it has towards children, people who are, for example, widowers, people who feel isolated and feel lonely to an extent. And the person who was testifying, she suggested this concept of sort of like truth and reconciliation, or like some type of healing, right? And she was very opposed to essentially breaking up Facebook because she thinks that the answers are sort of within healing. And I think I agree with her on some points, and I disagree on some points. However, I like to focus as well on AI ethics for healing and for the process of restoring. What we find with Ubuntu philosophy is that it's sort of like it gives us a framework for restorative justice, right? And the question is, is this a framework that just works for people, or can we actually apply this to companies? And one benefit which we can find from Ubuntu philosophy with this restorative framework, which is found in other in other knowledge systems as well, is that I think we can finally get to a place in society where we can learn to see sort of these companies not as like these isolated bad actors, too big to fail, who might be intentionally causing harm or whatever the case is, but to sort of begin to see ourselves as this interconnected ecosystem, right? We're tied together, right? This idea of relationality. Facebook is not just the problem by itself, it's also the market incentives, right? It's us, the users as well, who also participate in that. It's, just the different, the different forces, right, that exist within the company, outside of the company. Our consumer behaviors as well are also, part of that process. But if we begin to sort of look at this in a more relational perspective, right, and see, what role do we play as well? What role does the company play? How can we find a point of reconciliation? How can we find a point where these organizations can become members of society that are not just acting for their own benefit, but a company that can say, using the Ubuntu, philosophy, I am a company because of how I treat other people, right? Or how I interact with other people, or how or how my products shape the people, and how they can, shape, myself as well. We might be able to sort of then, see AI ethics sort of making more strides in actually bringing some type of change. And of course, I cannot, just stop there and say, well, ethics will solve everything. Of course, we would then need policy, we would need legislation, ways to enforce this. However, the underlying frameworks of how we think about these problems, if they were just tweaked just a little bit, I think we might be able to have different framings that can allow us to really address the problem, and to treat the problem really, and to think about not just the effects, the harms and the biases, but to really think of, what has put us in this situation? What are the ideologies that have placed us there? And to challenge those at the core. I truly believe that if we then challenge those ideologies at the core, question what it means to be a person, question this idea of we can just apply universal values globally, if we really challenge those assumptions and try to find within the global knowledge system that we can find from other societies, other cultures, we might be able to then to solve this problem together, because this is a type of problem that we have to solve together. This is a type of problem that requires new ideas, different ideas, new ways of thinking about justice, new ways of thinking about what is fair and what is good, and what is right. Okay, so I think I can just maybe leave it at that, and probably go through some questions.